The words were not whispered in a corridor or hidden inside a private letter. Lady Louise said them clearly, with her family close enough to hear every syllable. "I will never call Camilla my grandmother." In one brutal sentence, the young royal shattered the careful image of unity surrounding the monarchy and forced King Charles to confront a family wound that no title, ceremony, or palace statement could conceal. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Louise had spoken during a private family gathering at Windsor Castle, with Charles, Sophie, Edward, Camilla, and several household members close enough to witness the shock. The Queen Consort, a title given to the wife of a reigning king, had gently suggested that the younger generation might begin using warmer family language around her. What sounded like a small request carried enormous emotional weight because it asked everyone present to accept a bond that titles alone could not create. Louise was known for restraint. She respected tradition, avoided family drama, and rarely placed her feelings before royal duty. That history made her refusal impossible to dismiss as youthful anger. The young woman had carried the boundary silently for years, and when she finally spoke, every person in the room understood that something deeper had broken. Charles froze beside the fireplace and lowered the glass in his hand. The king looked toward his niece without speaking, caught between defending Camilla and recognizing that affection could not be commanded. He had spent years building acceptance around his marriage, yet Louise's words exposed a painful truth. The younger generation had inherited memories, loyalties, and wounds that no palace strategy could erase. Sophie moved closer to her daughter, but did not correct her. The trusted mother understood the danger of remaining silent before the sovereign, but she also knew that forcing Louise to withdraw would turn honesty into obedience. Edward watched both women, sensing that his family had crossed into a conflict no courteous phrase could repair. Camilla slowly set down her cup and asked whether Louise truly meant it. The Queen's voice remained controlled, though humiliation sharpened every word. Louise met her gaze and answered quietly, "Yes, I do." A senior aide immediately closed the drawing room doors and ordered staff to keep the exchange inside Windsor. A royal household is the group of advisors and employees who manage official duties and private arrangements. But containment had already failed. One witness had sent a message describing the confrontation before the instruction was given. To understand why Louise chose that devastating sentence, the palace would first have to confront the people caught between a young woman's loyalty, a king's marriage, and a grandmother whose memory still ruled the room. Behind the explosive statement stood four people carrying four very different versions of the same family. Louise saw loyalty, Sophie saw danger, Charles saw rejection, Camilla saw a verdict. None of them entered Windsor expecting a confrontation, yet each had arrived with years of unspoken emotion, and when the young royal finally drew her boundary, every buried grievance suddenly had a human face. Louise's loyalty had been shaped long before the argument. She grew up close to Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip, sharing private time with them at Windsor and Balmoral. Balmoral is the royal family's Scottish estate, often used for quieter family life away from formal duties. Her memories were rooted in ordinary affection, personal encouragement, carriage driving, and the certainty that she was loved without having to compete for attention. To her, grandmother was not a ceremonial label. It belonged to a relationship that could not be reassigned. Camilla carried a different history. The Queen had worked for years to become a steady presence beside Charles, and royal protocol gave her public precedence, meaning formal priority during ceremonies and official appearances. Yet rank could not create the private past normally held by a grandmother. She understood that difference in theory. Hearing Louise state it aloud still felt like a sentence passed on her entire place within the family. Sophie watched her daughter's hands tremble after the declaration. The Duchess of Edinburgh understood the pain beneath the words, but she also feared what the monarchy might do with them. A family could hear honesty. An institution might record disobedience. She moved closer to Louise because protecting her child mattered more than preserving the appearance of effortless unity. Charles carried the wound to Edward. The king said the rejection had not only targeted Camilla, it had challenged the family structure he had spent years defending. Edward listened with his jaw tight, before reminding his brother that affection could not be commanded. The monarch could establish titles, duties, and precedents. He could not issue an emotional bond by decree. Sophie later found a folded card inside Louise's handbag. 3 carefully written sentences waited there, proving the refusal had been prepared. Her daughter had expected pressure and chosen calm words, so nobody could dismiss her as reckless. Camilla then asked Charles to demand a formal apology before the next family appearance. The Queen believed Sophie and Edward's silence had made the insult official. Sophie refused to promise one. "You do not know what she heard at Sandringham," she told the king. Edward found Louise after midnight, sitting beside an old photograph of Queen Elizabeth. He knelt, waited, then placed it back into her hands. The real break had not begun with Louise's public refusal. It began at Sandringham, when one request transformed grief into resistance. Months before Windsor fell silent, the family gathered at Sandringham for what was meant to be a gentle act of remembrance. There were no cameras, no cheering crowds, and no reason to expect conflict. But during the ceremony, Camilla made one request involving Queen Elizabeth's private family tradition. Louise heard it, turned pale, and quietly left the room. That was the moment everything changed. Charles had arranged the private luncheon to mark an anniversary connected to his mother. Each relative was invited to share one personal memory before a collection of handwritten place cards and family photographs returned to the Royal Archives. The Royal Archives are the protected records preserving documents, letters, and objects connected to the monarchy's history. The gathering mattered because it offered the family a rare chance to mourn without performance, ceremony, or public expectation. Louise brought something deeply personal. The late Queen had once left a handwritten note beside her breakfast plate, using a private term of affection known only within their relationship. She had never shared those words publicly. To the young royal, that small message carried more warmth than any formal honor, because it proved her grandmother had seen her as a person, not merely another name inside the institution. Camilla changed the atmosphere with one request. The Queen Consort suggested that future grandchildren begin using the same affectionate name for her, describing the idea as a way to create continuity. Continuity means preserving a sense of connection as one reign and generation gives way to another. Louise heard something very different. The name was not tradition to her. It belonged to one woman, one relationship, and memories that could never be reassigned. Louise rose so suddenly that her chair scraped across the floor. She told Sophie she needed air, then left without raising her voice. The young woman broke down in a side corridor while clutching the note. When an aide approached, she pressed it against her chest and refused to let anyone take it. Sophie returned to the table and told Camilla that family language could not be reassigned like a patronage. A patronage is an official connection through which a royal supports a charity or cause. Charles called the remark unnecessarily hostile, and the cold exchange with his sister-in-law deepened the wound. Edward later learned that an aide had warned Camilla about the name's private meaning. The Queen had made the request knowing its emotional weight. That night, Louise told James nobody would pressure her into replacing their grandmother. She wrote, "I will never call her that," on the card Sophie later discovered. Weeks afterward, Camilla arranged for the subject to return at Windsor, believing direct discussion would settle it. When the family returned to the subject at Windsor, Louise was no longer an uncertain granddaughter, protecting a memory. She was a young woman prepared to defend it face to face. The palace expected Louise to soften once the doors were closed. Instead, privacy made her more fearless. With no cameras to impress and no public audience to satisfy, she looked directly at Camilla and explained why the word grandmother would never belong to her. What followed was not a royal debate about protocol. It was a deeply personal confrontation between grief and expectation. Charles asked everyone to remain in the Windsor drawing room, convinced that calm discussion could prevent the disagreement from becoming permanent. A drawing room is a private reception space used for family conversations and smaller gatherings. Yet the room divided before another word was spoken. Sophie and Edward stood behind Louise, while the king moved beside Camilla. Their positions created two visible camps, turning a private wound into a family test. Camilla asked why she was being punished for wanting closeness. The queen consort insisted that affection had been offered, not demanded. Louise answered that kindness and family titles were not the same thing. She could respect Camilla, support her beside Charles, and still refuse to rewrite what Queen Elizabeth meant to her. Louise's voice broke when she returned to Sandringham. The affectionate name had been one of the few private things she still possessed from her grandmother, she explained. It carried breakfasts, quiet encouragement, and memories untouched by public duty. Sophie reached for her daughter's hand, but the young royal continued alone. She would not hide behind her mother, or allow grief to be dismissed as immaturity. Camilla felt the room closing around her. She accused Sophie of encouraging the rejection, suggesting the Duchess had allowed old loyalties to harden inside Louise. Sophie stepped forward immediately. Her daughter had formed the boundary herself. After being placed under emotional pressure, she replied. Protecting that choice was not rebellion, it was motherhood. Charles asked Louise to withdraw the statement for the sake of family unity. The king expected resistance, but not the answer that followed. Unity without truth is only performance, she said. The monarch stared at his niece, visibly stunned that the youngest voice in the room had named the weakness everyone else had avoided. Edward pushed his chair back when Charles invoked respect for the crown. The Duke of Edinburgh, the title held by the monarch's brother, said his daughter would not be disciplined for protecting the memory of their mother. Camilla reached across the table toward Louise's hand. The young woman gently withdrew her fingers before contact. The silence that followed hurt more than accusation. Charles ended the discussion and summoned his private secretary, the senior aide responsible for official decisions and advice. The confrontation had exposed the wound, but the next battle would decide whether royal power could control what the heart refused to give. By morning, the disagreement had moved from the drawing room into the king's private office. Aides discussed statements, seating arrangements, family appearances, and the risk of public embarrassment. Yet beneath the machinery stood one impossible problem. Charles could control invitations, titles, and ceremonies, but he could not order Louise to feel what she did not feel. The crown had reached the boundary of its own power. Charles listened as his private secretary warned that punishing Louise could create a far greater scandal. A private secretary is the senior advisor responsible for managing a royal's official work and communication. Any forced apology, removed invitation, or staged display of affection might make the monarchy appear emotionally coercive. Silence and distance were safer. Camilla's legal position remained secure, but the queen understood that public acceptance was more fragile. Rejection from a younger, admired relative threatened the image of a healed and fully blended family. Charles read a proposed statement calling the Windsor confrontation a misunderstanding. The king set it down and admitted to Anne that the wording was false. Louise had understood exactly what she was saying. His sister did not offer comfort. The Princess Royal reminded him that their mother had earned affection through decades of personal presence. No announcement, title, or royal instruction could transfer that bond to someone else. Charles bristled at Anne's honesty, but did not dismiss her. His anger came from knowing she was right. As a husband, he wanted to shield Camilla from humiliation. As sovereign, he understood that using royal authority to demand affection would make the wound deeper. One advisor suggested removing Louise from an upcoming balcony appearance until she apologized. A balcony appearance is a formal public moment when senior royals gather before crowds as a symbol of unity. Charles considered the recommendation briefly, unaware that Sophie was already prepared to withdraw Edward, Louise, and James from the event if her daughter were punished. Edward carried unexpected leverage. The Duke of Edinburgh reminded officials that Louise had never depended on a major working royal position. Removing visibility or access would not control her. It would only make her refusal appear more principled and the palace more insecure. William then sent Charles a private written message. The prince urged him not to turn grief into a constitutional display. Younger royals, he warned, would remember whether honesty had been protected or punished. Charles stood with the recommendation in his hand, tore it once down the middle, and placed both pieces inside a closed drawer. He rejected punishment, but approved a carefully arranged family luncheon, hoping one controlled appearance might restore unity. The king had stepped back from punishment, but the attempt to manufacture harmony would produce consequences no palace advisor could contain. The palace chose a photograph as its solution. One table, one family, one carefully timed appearance that would suggest the Windsor confrontation had ended in forgiveness. But when the moment arrived, an empty chair revealed more than any statement could hide. Louise did not attend, and Camilla's reaction showed that the rejection had now become a visible reality, rather than a private wound. Palace staff prepared the reconciliation luncheon at Clarence House as an informal family gathering, yet a photographer had been positioned to capture everyone leaving together. Clarence House is the London residence used by Charles and Camilla for both private life and official work. The plan depended on one image suggesting unity without forcing the family to explain what had happened at Windsor. Behind that careful arrangement, however, Louise was being asked to perform forgiveness she had never offered. Sophie received a direct message that her daughter's attendance was strongly expected. No formal apology was demanded, but an aide suggested Louise should greet Camilla warmly enough to end speculation. The young woman dressed for the luncheon and reached the bottom of the staircase before stopping. She told her mother she could not participate in a photograph that would imply she had withdrawn her words. Sophie removed her own coat and chose to remain beside her. Camilla entered the dining room and immediately noticed two unused settings. The Queen Consort asked Charles whether Sophie and Louise were still coming, though her hardened expression suggested she already understood the answer. A reconciliation luncheon is a private gathering, arranged to repair tension through conversation and shared presence. This one had failed before anyone sat down. Edward arrived alone. The Duke of Edinburgh quietly told the king that Louise would not be used to repair a public image. Charles stared at his brother, while servants waited beside untouched plates. Their exchange carried years of loyalty and one unmistakable warning. Edward would not sacrifice his daughter's honesty to protect the appearance of royal unity. A servant removed Louise's untouched place card, while Camilla watched from the doorway. She said nothing as the name disappeared from the table. Edward left after only 23 minutes, and photographers immediately noticed his solitary arrival and rapid departure. Questions spread before the luncheon had formally ended. Camilla withdrew into a side room, removed a brooch Charles had given her, and cancelled the rest of her engagements. Anger finally gave way to visible hurt. When Louise later learned that the Queen had isolated herself, guilt entered the young woman's certainty, not for defending her grandmother, but for the cruelty her words may have carried. The staged reconciliation had failed, yet the sight of Camilla's pain forced Louise to ask whether an unbreakable boundary could still be expressed, without becoming an act of humiliation. There were no secretaries, no prepared phrases, and no family members standing behind either woman. Louise entered the small sitting room alone. Camilla was already waiting, not as Queen Consort, but as the person wounded by the words spoken at Windsor. For the first time, they faced each other without the protection of titles, and discovered that reconciliation did not require Louise to surrender the truth. Louise had requested the meeting after hearing that Camilla had withdrawn from several engagements. She asked Sophie to arrange it, but insisted that Charles and Edward remain outside. Neither side would be allowed to claim that a husband, father, or palace office had controlled the conversation. They met in a modest sitting room at Clarence House, the London residence used by the King and Queen for private life and official duties. Tea waited on a low table, untouched through the opening silence. Louise spoke first. She told Camilla that she did not hate her and did not deny her importance to Charles. The young royal respected the life she had built beside him. But grandmother belonged to a relationship, not a position. It carried memories of Queen Elizabeth, private words, ordinary kindness, and years that could not be reassigned through family expectation. Camilla admitted what she had truly wanted. The Queen had hoped acceptance from the younger generation would prove the family had finally moved beyond the past. She believed one affectionate title might confirm that old wounds had healed. Louise answered quietly that healing could not depend on younger relatives pretending the past had meant less than it did. Camilla then confessed the Sandringham mistake. She had been warned that the private name carried special meaning for Louise and should never have requested it. Her desire to belong had made her ignore the emotional cost. The admission mattered because it removed the final excuse. The wound had not been accidental. It had been caused by insecurity allowed to become pressure. Louise refused to retract her statement. It remained true, yet she apologized for delivering it in a way that made Camilla feel publicly stripped of dignity. The Queen accepted that distinction. She told Louise she could always address her simply as Camilla, and promised never again to ask for a family title that had not been freely offered. Louise finally lifted the untouched teapot and poured 2 cups. Camilla accepted hers with both hands. When the door opened, Charles saw them standing calmly together, neither defeated and neither pretending the pain had vanished. Their private understanding had ended the personal battle, but the country was only just beginning to hear the sentence that caused it. By sunrise, the palace secret belonged to the world. Louise's sentence appeared across television screens, newspaper stands, and phones throughout Britain. Some called it cruel, others called it courageous. But the debate quickly moved beyond one young woman and one queen consort. It became a national argument over grief, loyalty, blended families, and whether royal titles could ever replace emotional truth. A major morning broadcaster opened with the words, "A royal granddaughter has drawn a line the palace could not erase." The conflict was no longer framed as a small family disagreement. It had become an intergenerational struggle over memory and belonging. An intergenerational conflict is a dispute shaped by the different experiences and loyalties of older and younger family members. Buckingham Palace confirmed that a private conversation had occurred and stated that Louise and Camilla retained mutual respect. By refusing to deny the quotation, the palace effectively confirmed it. Public sympathy divided sharply. Camilla's defenders argued that the Queen had spent years supporting Charles and deserved compassion rather than another rejection linked to the family's past. Louise's supporters answered that service beside the king could not transfer the unique place Queen Elizabeth held in her granddaughter's life. Both sides claimed kindness. Neither agreed on what kindness required. Charles watched the coverage over breakfast until a commentator called the dispute proof that royal unity remained dangerously fragile. The king switched off the television and remained silent. Anne reminded her brother that the public was debating a confrontation Louise and Camilla had already handled with greater honesty. The Princess Royal warned that palace panic could reopen a wound the 2 women had begun to close. Outside Windsor Castle, a newspaper vendor raised a front page carrying Louise's words in enormous white letters. One image showed the late Queen smiling beside her granddaughter. Another showed Camilla leaving Clarence House alone. A crowd gathered in silence before an elderly woman placed flowers near the gates with a handwritten card. No one replaces a grandmother. Kindness means accepting that. Louise refused to let her boundary become permission for cruelty. Through Sophie, she released one carefully worded sentence. Love for one person should never require disrespect toward another. Camilla answered with equal restraint. The Queen Consort described Louise as a thoughtful young woman whose feelings deserved respect. Charles then called the Edinburgh household. The king invited Louise to the next family service, with no staged affection, forced greeting, or demanded apology. She agreed to attend. The public had delivered its judgment, but the lasting verdict would come when Louise entered the royal chapel and chose how to face Camilla before the entire family. The final answer did not come through another statement. It came inside the royal chapel, where Louise walked toward Camilla with the entire family watching. She did not use the forbidden title. She did not pretend the conflict had never happened. Instead, she offered something more honest: respect without replacement, peace without surrender, and a form of family loyalty strong enough to survive the truth. Louise arrived beside Sophie and Edward for the next private chapel service. Charles watched closely as his niece approached the Queen Consort before taking her seat. A private chapel service is a family religious gathering held without the wider public or press. Palace staff had received clear instructions: no arranged photograph, no scripted greeting, and no manufactured display of affection. The moment would belong entirely to the two women. Louise stopped before Camilla and said, "Good morning, Camilla." Her voice carried warmth without surrender. The missing word grandmother remained unmistakable, yet so did the absence of hostility. She had not withdrawn her boundary. She had simply refused to let that boundary become cruelty. Camilla answered, "Good morning, Louise," and touched her arm gently. The Queen did not correct her, ask for more, or look toward Charles for support. By accepting the name freely offered, she recovered something pressure could never have secured: dignity without control. Charles finally understood what the family had been trying to tell him. They had not rejected his wife. They had rejected the belief that her place must be protected by taking emotional language that belonged to another relationship. The king had spent years defending Camilla's rank, yet rank had never been the true issue. Love could not be granted through ceremony. Sophie felt relief as Louise sat beside her. The Duchess recognized that her daughter had changed more than one family disagreement. By remaining firm without becoming vindictive, Louise had forced the monarchy to separate obedience from affection, and genuine unity from performance. Charles then established a new private rule. No relative would be pressured to use personal titles for spouses who entered the family later. Forms of address inside family life would develop naturally and remain beyond official intervention. A form of address is the name or title used when speaking directly to someone. After the service, Louise paused beside a framed photograph of Queen Elizabeth. Camilla stopped several steps away and allowed her to look alone. Louise then turned, waited for her, and the two left side by side. And in that quiet walk, the crisis reached its final meaning. Camilla did not become Louise's grandmother, but she was finally accepted as herself, and the monarchy became stronger the moment it stopped demanding anything more. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.